The Enkaus is the brand new rifle in Warframe that came with the update last week. And originally, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't even want to make a video on it because I thought it was just kinda okay. However, when I tested it and saw the potential of this thing, well, I just had to. So, in this Warframe guide, I'm gonna show you how ridiculously strong the Enkaus actually is, plus multiple builds and fun synergies. Big shoutouts to all the generous channel members, and now, let's jump right into it. And starting out, I want to do by talking about how you can actually get your greedy 10 fingers on the Enkaus. In order to be able to farm it, you will have to finish the Chains of Harrow quest, which will then in turn give you access to the new game mode, Folly's Hunt, that you can access by going to the Vesper Relay next to Venus. The blueprint as well as the components to build the Enkaus, technically you can get them as drops from the mission directly. However, when we take a look at the drop tables right here, well, calling it a low drop chance would be a little bit of an understatement. So, alternatively, you're gonna grind the new resource Atrementum from this game mode, and then go to Zorba, whom you're gonna find next to the room of the Arbiters of Hexes on any given relay, and he sells you all this stuff as well. But now, how does this thing actually work? The base fire is very straightforward. It is a beam gun that shoots out a beam of paint. However, in contrast to many other beam guns, this paint beam doesn't link to nearby enemies. It's really a single target weapon only. I mean, you can give it punch through, but you get the point. However, the Enkaus also has a secondary fire, which shoots out a sort of paint blob that will hit enemies in an AoE and put paint all over them. This paint blob on the floor will linger for a while, and other enemies that run into it will get inked as well. And the reason why you want to ink these enemies in the first place is that whenever you shoot an enemy that is inked, you're actually gonna regenerate ammunition. On top of that, and that is actually the most fun part about this gun, when you're attacking an inked enemy and the enemy is down to 35% of their maximum HP, then they're just gonna instantly die. You can, by the way, see that by this big tier 3 red crit with a guaranteed corrosive status proc. That is what appears over every enemy once this 35% threshold is met, and depending on the enemy level, this damage number is gonna go higher and higher, as I think it probably represents 35% of their maximum HP or something. I'm not 100% sure, don't quote me on this, but yeah, long story short, once you see the big red number, that means an enemy just lost their last 35% health in one big tick. Now, looking at the stats of the Enkaus, to be fair, they're actually not all that impressive, which probably has to do with the fact that it is technically a more of a mid-game weapon, as you can get it after Chains of Harrow already. We're dealing with a very clear status-focused weapon. 32% base status chance is really darn high. However, it does come at a cost because the crit performance isn't all that great. 16% crit chance, 1.8 times multiplier. It's not terrible, you can certainly go for it. However, it's definitely not impressive either. A good thing then that Warframe has a lot of different abilities and arcanes that can give you external crit chance, which helps to bypass this flaw a little bit in later game. The only special thing that I want to point out here is that by default, the Enkaus is going to deal corrosive damage, which is very nice because it makes it one of the very few weapons in the game that can have corrosive and viral present at the same time without external buffs. Before we go on to the next chapter, there is one more thing that I haven't heard anyone talk about yet, and that is actually very interesting. I'm not sure if it's a bug or if it's actually intentional, but you definitely should know this when you play the Enkaus. See, these big red final hits, they kinda sorta seem to not be considered weapon hits in many regards. What I mean is, for a tier 3 red crit, you would of course expect that the more crit damage you have on the weapon, the bigger the number. But that's not true. The number is always the same on the same type of enemy of the same level, which is also the reason leading me to believe that this number is actually just the leftover HP of the enemy. So, that makes sense, right? Well, yeah, until we look a bit deeper. See, one thing that I noticed is, when you have any headshot kill related effects on your Warframe, then the Enkaus can only trigger those against non-inked enemies. As you see right here, if I just normally take them out, I stack up the duration of my invisibility. However, the moment I ink these enemies and therefore trigger these big red final hits, all of a sudden my headshot kills don't extend the ability duration anymore. What this means is that these big red hits do not trigger certain effects even though they clearly should. And that's not the only case where it behaves weirdly. Remember how we just said that no matter how much crit damage you put on the weapon, the number always remains the same? Well, that is only true as long as we're talking about normal crit damage modifiers. However, if we, let's say, go and use Arcane Crepuscular, which gives us a flat 3x final crit damage multiplier, then all of a sudden, we deal like 20 times more damage with those. See right here, this is Visible Harrow without Arcane Crepuscular, looking at 100,000-ish damage. And then this right here is Invisible Harrow with Arcane Crepuscular, all of a sudden dealing millions of damage with the same hit. And no, the fact that it's Harrow doesn't have any influence on this. I didn't switch my 4th ability on. There's no crit chance buffing going on, right? This right here is only the difference caused by Arcane Crepuscular and nothing else. Especially this Arcane Crepuscular interaction, which gives us so much more damage. I actually have a fun synergy later in the video with which we can get ridiculous millions of damage out of this function. Stay tuned for that. But alright, let's talk about the one thing that you're here for, and that would be the builds. I gotta apologize a little bit in advance because this one is a bit more casual. I'm gonna be out of town for the Easter weekend, so I don't have that much time for editing and all the fancy stuff. You know, the big fancy videos are gonna continue from next week on. I hope you don't mind. As for the builds, I have basic builds prepared for you that work on pretty much any setup, and then, and that is the more interesting part, I also want to showcase a couple Warframe synergies that I find super duper cool. The first build that I want to showcase today is a basic Blast build. Blast is very strong on this weapon because it doesn't have any AoE capabilities in and of itself, and you know, Blast kind of sort of gives that to the weapon. What I did right here is, in the arcane slot I went for Primary Crux, as this one gives us not only ammo efficiency, but also a crazy ton of status chance, which is, you know, the one big strong point of the weapon anyway. Then, to get Blast, we of course put Blast on the weapon, and because it is a damage over time build, we're talking about faction damage, we're going to talk about Elementalist mod, of course we go for multi-shot and base damage. However, I should say if you really wanted to add something else, you might as well put it here, because if you have a good external source of priming, then Galvanized Aptitude is going to give you enough base damage to not necessarily need Serration. Treat this one as more of a flex slot. And then finally, I chose to go for a Galvanized Scope to give myself a decent bit of crit chance, because I like to run, external crit damage sources like Tenacious Bond, like Arcane Crepuscular on many builds to get my crit damage from there. Just, overall to make sure that the crit portion of the weapon is not completely neglected. Now, the cool thing with this build is that, as we said previously, the alt-fire mechanic, where the enemies, when they're inked, they just pop once they go down to 35% of their maximum HP, that works even if they get killed by a blast proc. So as you can see right here, even if I don't kill the enemy that I'm actually shooting at, you will see red numbers going off left and right, which is just the bystanding enemies getting killed by the blast explosion that I'm causing on my actual target. You can of course also combine this with Zata's Whisper, because as we all know, Blast plus Zata's Whisper is always a very nice affair, but you gotta be a little bit careful, because if you activate Zata's Whisper and then you shoot the ink, you're gonna Zata's Whisper everybody, and it's gonna make it a little bit difficult to actually get the headshots in to kill the enemies quickly. But yeah, getting back to the Enkaus builds for a second, this would be the standard Blast build. You can use it on literally any setup. The more buffing you have, the stronger of course it gets. Another one that I definitely wanted to try out with a high status chance rifle like this would be Primary Debilitate. This has been one of my favorite arcanes ever since it came out. However, I should say I find it pretty underwhelming on the Enkaus. What I did here is I went for a build that is pretty similar to what we had before, just that here we add radiation damage with the radiated reload, we add Malignant Force and Rhyme rounds to get viral, so that we have a total of 3 combined elements on the weapon, which will then give us all sorts of, standard elements with the help of Primary Debilitate. The good thing here is that we get a whole lot of base damage out of this through Galvanized Aptitude. However, as I'm also going to show you in a split second here, the strength of this is not all that amazing. Like, don't get me wrong, against single target, once all the buffs are stacked up, this is definitely not bad. You see some impressive numbers, but it of course lacks any sort of group clearing capabilities. What you could potentially do if you have Thermal Sunder subsumed on your Warframe of choice, you could use that with a Thermal Transfer Augment to put Blast onto this build. I just rather use the normal Blast build, if you get what I'm saying. Oh, by the way, I totally forgot, I don't have 2 basic builds prepared, I actually have 3 basic builds prepared, the third one being Primary Overcharge. I also tried this one out, it's basically the same build as for the basic Blast build, just that we changed the Arcane to Primary Overcharge, and this one is also pretty cool. I use this one on my Invisible Harrow, because with Invisible Harrow you can use Spectral Serration for even more base damage, and now that we have a lot of energy and a lot of multi-shot, like, what you're seeing right here, right? What you're seeing right here, 3 million damage, that is not Harrow's ultimate. As you can see in the bottom right corner of the screen, my ultimate that gives me more crit chance, that's not even on. All I do is go invisible, blast into the enemy, also need to make sure that I have full energy, otherwise my multi-shot arcane doesn't trigger, and then it just goes absolutely kablooey and it deals ridiculous numbers. But, ladies and gentle frames, I promised you specific Warframe weapon interactions, and that is exactly what you're gonna get. So let's now also take a look at those. The first one that I have for you would be Thermal Sunder. Given the fact that Thermal Sunder is a Helminth subsume, that means you can use it on any Warframe out there, and it makes it very cool because with the Thermal Transfer Augment, you can infuse Blast on any weapon. If we remember the basic Blast build right here, we used 2 mod slots to put Blast on the weapon in the first place, so with a Thermal Sunder based build, these 2 now are completely open. And I used them to put in Vital Sense to give me more crit damage, in combination with Galvanized Scope, that's actually pretty decent. And the other one, that's kind of sort of flex slot, you can do whatever you like, you can go for more Fire Rate, you can maybe go for Shred, Fire Rate and Punch Through, or maybe if you wanted to, you could even go Primed Firestorm to give the Ink Blob a bit more range here. Like, we're gonna get a whole bunch of Fire Rate, and all the blast comes from Thermal Sunder, so we don't even have to mod that onto the weapon. It is very darn strong. And of course, you don't have to do it with Gauss. Thermal Sunder, as I said, is subsumable. Use it on any other Warframe and enjoy. The next synergy that I have for you would be with everybody's favorite girl, Wisp. Or to be more precise, with literally any other Warframe as well, because it has to do with Breach Surge. See, the cool thing about Breach Surge is that the enemies of course emit the Surge Sparks whenever they die, and the damage of those Surge Sparks is based on the last damage tick they took before they die, aka the one hit that took them out. And of course, with the Enkaus having a guaranteed tier 3 red crit scaling with enemy maximum HP as the last hit on every single enemy, it doesn't take a PhD in rocket science to imagine that this would be a pretty strong combination with Breach Surge. See, the problem with this is that there's so many damage numbers going on, I can't even see which damage number was caused by the Surge Spark that was emitted from the final hit on any given enemy. In one of my other test runs, I saw I think it was a 22 million Breach Surge headshot, so the numbers here are getting pretty darn crazy. And last, but definitely not least, why don't we just combine 2 synergies into one with our favorite flappy frame, Zephyr. See, the first thing that we use here is Thermal Sunder to infuse Blast onto the weapon. You know, the same thing that I just showcased with Gauss, and also the same build that I showcased with Thermal Sunder. But Zephyr, of course, has more than that in the form of her tornadoes, which lift up enemies. So we ink the enemies, and then we go kablooey and everybody's dead. This is just ridiculously strong. What is this? I did not know that environmental objects would float up as well. That is so nice. So yeah, as you can clearly see, Zephyr a total gem as well. And now also check out my full guide on Folly, the brand new Warframe, right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demonoid Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Underkania 2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Han Taras, Patrisator, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awindai, Zengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yako Ivan Gonzalez, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.